Welcome everyone to the G20 Perspectives panel. My name is Robert McGregor and I will be your moderator this evening. For your information, this event is being recorded on video and will potentially appear on broadcast television, on the radio, and it will likely appear on the internet. So just keep that in mind in case you don't want to appear in any of those mediums when you're asking a question. So this is how tonight will proceed. Each panelist will be given 10 minutes to speak. And then after the panelists have all presented in order, there will be a Q&A session where members of the audience can ask questions of the panelists or make brief comments as well. And you may direct your questions to individual panelists or the panel in general, and whichever panelist feels most knowledgeable or would like to speak on that particular issue is free to do so. Here are some ground rules as well before we proceed. All cell phones should be turned off, please. There will be no heckling of panelists or audience members when they ask questions. Let's try our best to be open and friendly and make a friendly and open atmosphere where all perspectives can be voiced. Questions will be asked at the microphone stand located in the middle of the aisle. If you wish to ask a question, please line up behind the microphone when the Q&A session starts. When you're asking your questions, please keep them short and to the point. And you may ask only one question at a time. If you'd like to ask more than one question, please return to the back of the line and wait until the people who haven't had a chance to ask a question yet have done so. And that's it. So, on to our first panelist. David Camfield is a local activist and one of the editors of the new Socialist webzine. David?
Thanks, Rob, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm really glad to see so many people turning out to discuss this important issue. I really want to speak to three issues tonight. The first, what the G20 summit was really about, because I think this was generally missing from a lot of the post-summit discussions, both in the corporate media and the left media, and in discussions that people have been having, and that is about the coming austerity program that's going to be delivered to us. I want to say something also briefly about the debate that's happened about legitimate and illegitimate forms of protest, and then I want to address the implications from what happened in Toronto for the coming attack on public sector services and public sector workers that we're going to be experiencing from all levels of government. So first, a lot of the discussion that's taken place is focused on important issues such as police repression, restrictions on civil and political rights, and the attacks on property carried out by a small number of protesters. These are all important things, but I think this is missing the big picture. The big picture is what was being discussed behind the closed doors. Just to quote from a CBC report on the 27th of June, Prime Minister Stephen Harper has hailed an agreement among G20 leaders at the close of their Toronto summit on a Canadian-led plan for industrialized nations to slash their deficits in half within 3 years. Harper also said he expects Canada will cut its deficit in half and put its debt load on a stable or downward path by next year. Now the point here is not whether Canada or any other state will meet its deficit cutting targets. These are voluntary targets after all. But how this whole discussion reinforces a belief which has come to be treated as an unquestionable holy truth in official politics in Canada and in most other advanced capitalist countries. When I say it's become an unquestionable truth, I mean if you look at all the political parties in the House of Commons and most of the media commentary, if you look even at what the NDP provincial government here in Manitoba does, they all share this belief. And the belief is that deficits are bad, that a large deficit is a crisis, the deficits must be slashed, and that austerity measures to cut public services and jobs are bitter medicine that we have to accept for the sake of ourselves and our children. That's a bunch of claims that have become treated as unquestionable. I want to say a couple of things in response to this. The first is that deficits in Canada are low. The federal deficit in Canada is by far the lowest of the G7 industrialized countries. Second, and more importantly, cuts in the name of deficits are not necessary. There are always alternatives to this austerity agenda. I will argue that, in fact, high deficits are a problem for those who run the capitalist economy. They're a problem for governments and CEOs. They're not a problem that working people should shoulder. In other words, this problem is their problem, not our problem. That's the title of a short article I wrote on this recently. Our problem, ordinary people's problem, is what they are going to do to cut deficits at our expense. When we accept the idea that the deficit is our problem, an idea that they were trying to reinforce from the message coming out of the G20 summit, we end up supporting or tolerating cuts to education, healthcare, social assistance, other government services, along with privatization, higher tuition, and other user fees. That kind of austerity, which we've seen in different parts of Canada at different times, the federal Liberal government brought in big cuts in the mid-1990s. We see now in Greece and in the UK, big moves towards austerity agendas and so on. Sadly, it's a sign of how far these kind of right-wing anti-deficit ideas have penetrated. If we look at a press release that was put out at the end of June during the G20 summit by the president of the Canadian Labour Congress. The CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, is the umbrella organization that most unions in Canada belong to. It was involved in organizing the main march against the G20 summit. But this press release stated, quote, "We are urging the leaders," that is the G20 leaders, "not to move too quickly to austerity measures." In other words, not that the austerity measures themselves must be rejected, but the message to the leaders is don't go too quickly. Whereas, in other words, that accepts the necessity of these austerity measures to some extent. And unfortunately, this whole idea that we have to be prepared to accept these austerity measures was reinforced by the G20 summit and the discussion around it. So in large part, I think the summit was about building support for this austerity agenda. The second thing I want to say something about briefly, and that's the debate about legitimate and illegitimate protest. Really, this is a debate about good protesters and bad protesters. That's what it comes down to. The attempt to depict some people as good and some people as bad. I think we need to ask a very hard question about this idea of legitimate protest or good protest. I think really what it comes down to, that gets defined as good protest is protest that stays within the limits that are imposed not just by what the law says we can do, but what the police say we can do at any particular time, which changes. The very idea of legitimate and illegitimate protest is an idea for those who rule us, and what gets counted as legitimate protest is protest that poses very little or no threat to their power. So for all those of us who consider ourselves supporters of social justice, it's the wrong debate for us to be having, this debate about legitimate and illegitimate protest. I think we need to be asking different questions, like, what's the best strategy for us to resist the neoliberal austerity agenda that's coming down? And what's the best strategy for fighting for social change? And what kind of tactics can we use to try to advance that strategy? The discussion of those questions is something we're going to have at another time. This really isn't the place for that, I think. Then the third thing I wanted to speak to is about the implications of the events in Toronto and the debate that happened after the protests. What are the implications of this for the future? We're still in a global economic crisis. The crisis is not over. Roughly $20 trillion has been devoted to bailing out the banks and stimulus spending, and this did avert a collapse of the world economy in 2008, 2009. That's one of the reasons the deficits have gone up around the world, is because of the immense amount of money that was required to bail out capitalism. But we're seeing real signs of economic activity in the US falling again. It's quite possible that this is an economic crisis which is going to last for years. And in response to this crisis, the leaders of the G20, along with the heads of the International Monetary Fund and the like, are preparing a decade of austerity. They've even used some of this language. In other words, big cutbacks to social services in the name of deficit reduction. So the economic crisis for them is a chance to do something which they haven't yet done in many countries, including Canada. And that's gut the welfare state, not just weaken it, but gut it, through further cuts and opening up the delivery of public services like healthcare to for-profit firms on a bigger scale. These kinds of attacks on the welfare state will lower the quality of life for most people, they'll bring greater insecurity, and they're going to be particularly hard for those who are less well off, particularly women, people of color, and indigenous people. And the thing that goes along with this, the second part of this agenda, is the attack on public sector workers, like people who work in libraries, for example. Public sector workers are usually unionized. We have better job security, pensions, benefits, and sometimes wages than people who work in the private sector. The public sector has been an important source of better jobs for women and people of color. so public sector workers are going to be on the block as well. In other words, this economic crisis is an opportunity for those in power to advance the neoliberal agenda that capitalist and pro-capitalist politicians have been pursuing for about 3 decades. So if we bear that in mind, then, there are 3 implications of the events in Toronto that I think are very worrying. The first is that there were many restrictions on civil rights and widespread arrests in Toronto. I want to particularly underline the targeted and preemptive arrests that took place of social justice activists. Before any windows were broken or any bank machines attacked, in the middle of the night before the main protest took place, people were actually woken up, dragged out of their beds, and arrested preemptively and charged with all sorts of ridiculous charges for being part of the groups that organized the protests in Toronto. And there was also a great deal of police brutality. This is all a precedent for a higher level of state repression. Secondly, unfortunately, some people who supposedly are opponents of the Tories have been more concerned with broken windows than with anything else. For example, those who joined in the mainstream attacks on so-called anarchists for vandalism instead of focusing on the people who are behind the austerity agenda. And third, too many people have been diverted into this debate I mentioned about legitimate and illegitimate protest instead of asking the really important question that's going to make a big difference: what's a winning strategy to resist the austerity agenda that we're faced with? So just to close, I think we have some urgent tasks. We need to be committed to fundraising for the huge legal costs of the hundreds of people arrested in Toronto. We need to be organizing a political campaign to defend the right to protest and against state repression. And we also need to be engaging in popular education about the austerity agenda and a serious discussion about what kind of strategy and tactics we can use to build a movement to resist this austerity agenda which is going to be inflicted upon us. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Our next panelist is Robert Chernomas, who is a professor of economics at the University of Manitoba, a board member with the Council of Canadians, and a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
Apparently I'm the only panelist who's actually there, although I've see some people in the audience who are there who might want to speak about it. So part of my mandate is to talk about what I saw there before I do what I want to do, which is talk a bit about the economics without trying to repeat much of what David just said. What does $1.2 billion in security forces buy you in a city like Toronto? And well, one of the things it buys you is that when you landed in the airport on Thursday afternoon, there were police cruisers all over the tarmac of the airport, everywhere but on the runway. And then when you sort of got into the airport, it was relatively low-key, more English than it was French in terms of what the security forces looked like. But there were all kinds of people you could tell who were in the airport, although the airport was relatively sparse. I don't know how many of you have been on Yonge Street in Toronto, you know, sort of north of Fifth Avenue in New York. It's a pretty congested place. Well, my bus couldn't take me all the way to my hotel because they wouldn't allow the bus through. And so we stopped around Eaton Place and I had to walk to my hotel, which was about a mile away. And Yonge Street was empty. I mean, when I say empty, there was about 5% of the people you normally see. It was an occupied city. It was stunning. It was remarkable. And it wasn't just when I went from the airport to my hotel, but the next morning I went to a news conference and it was still empty. And then I went back after having been at a bar around Eaton Place about 1 o'clock at night. There were more police than there were people in the streets. And the police weren't simply walking around individually, they were walking around in troops, 20 at a time. It was stunning that this was Toronto, this was in Canada, that this was occurring. At one point, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty was marching, a couple of thousand, trying to march towards where the G20 were meeting. And we were at Massey Hall, a bunch of us, the Council of Canadians and others had organized. 2,700 people came out, filled the place. Vandana Shiva, Bob Barlow, Naomi Klein were there. The place was packed. But right before it started, we heard there was this march. So we went out into the streets to try to join them. And they blocked us. They wouldn't let us. They wouldn't let us join them. They simply had police barricades on both sides. But when you stood in the corner, looking across at the Ontario Coalition of Poverty, trying to get across, what was amazing is what we saw in front of us. There were rapid deployment troops of all kinds. They came out on bikes, in shorts, and in caps. They came out on horseback, and then, of course, they came out in dark uniforms, heavily armored, including guns which apparently shoot both rubber bullets and tear gas. This was Toronto. And then, of course, the march itself, which took us about 4 hours. The Black Bloc was sort of intermingled with the crowd. One of the more amazing things, of course, is we saw this cruiser, which the media showed over and over and over again. And we looked at the cruiser and said, the cops aren't doing anything about it. It was like bait. They were sort of leaving it there. And so we have no idea, of course, who lit it on fire, what happened. But, and of course, my comment about the media is that, you know, they basically repeated the stories over and over again about what was going on. There was no content. I left Queen's Park at about 5 o'clock after a 4-hour walk, went back to my hotel because I couldn't see much going on. Of course, when I got to my hotel 20 minutes later, what you heard, of course, was their tear gas was flying and rubber bullets were flying at Queen's Park, so I missed the revolution, went back to my hotel. And I was going to run back, but I figured by that time it had moved somewhere else. But the remarkable thing, of course, about the media is there was no coverage or content. Now, I have not done a systematic count of what the media did, but everything I watched was all about the burning car. And I guess the media got angry at times because sometimes the cops, of course, abused them, as well as abusing the marchers, as opposed to looking at the content. A couple of amazing things, of course, is Sarkozy, the president of France, said he would never let this happen. He would never spend $1 billion on security. Of course, what he'd probably do, rather than put it in the middle of Paris, where he would have a revolt, he'll put an army base somewhere. And the mayor of Toronto said this was an outrage. We should have had a convention center off to the side instead of having the whole city occupied. Well, what was Harper about? Well, I would assert what Harper was about was asserting his power. He was among the most reactionary of the leaders of the G20, absolutely opposed to any kind of environmental regulation. He's opposed to any kind of regulation on the banks. And a lot of the other leaders had sort of big feelings about this. And so I think what he was doing is he was asserting his power, asserting his position with respect to the environment, respect to taxes, respect to regulation. It was essentially class warfare. I'm an economist. How much time I've got left, I don't know. But I'm going to just talk very quickly about, that's good, 5 minutes, good time. Quickly, this fiscal stimulus is the Keynesian fiscal stimulus perspective. And then there's, of course, austerity. And what's the fiscal stimulus? Well, when they do the austerity business, the Keynesians would say it's bad policy. They just don't get it. What it's really about is class warfare, as David sort of described it. It's about how we can continue to maintain no regulation, no taxes, and how to cut back wages and salaries. Once again, as an economist, I'm going to just give you a couple of numbers here. Canada and Germany were in favor of course, austerity. The Americans are so much more worried about the Depression, they're more interested in fiscal stimulus. But fiscal stimulus isn't the same thing as having a progressive economic alternative. StatsCan reported some years ago that the average Canadian, the so-called median income, was the same in 2004 as it was in 1982. And so what's happened in Canada is wages have been stagnant while productivity has grown, and therefore profits have grown. This is all about profits. There's nothing else that matters, but power is essential in order for profits to be realized. Workers' productivity during that period improved by 51% over that 30 years, while wages remained flat. The Canadian workers' share of national income is the lowest it's been in 40 years. How do we compensate? What do? Well, we borrow money from the banks in order to live at the same standard of living we tried to live before, because wages are either stagnant. Or in the United States, of course, it's much worse. In the United States, it's not the wages are stagnant, they're actually falling. This has been done systematically through central bank policy, through trade policy, through tax policy, and of course they want to continue this. And since there's not much resistance, and any kind of resistance was going to be met by the kind of occupied city we found in Toronto, this is the sort of, I would argue, political perspective that's being established. The United States is remarkable numbers. Between 73 and 2000, the average income of the bottom 90% of the American taxpayer fell by 7%. Incomes of the top 1% rose by 148, top 1/10, 343%, and the top 1/100th by an amazing 599%. Keynesian demand, well, you know what? They don't care if we buy 10,000 cars or one $80 million submarine. It's all, you can create demand that way. The real issue is, it's about class warfare and how to continue and be successful at it. Joel Rogers, director of the Center on Wisconsin Strategy, has made a recent calculation. Had wages tracked productivity as they had over the previous 30 years in the United States, the average American family would make $20,000 more. In Canada, it's 10,000 over that same period. Class warfare has been on since neoliberalism began, and Harper is going to accelerate this. What would we do about this? What's the alternative? In 30 seconds or less. Financial transactions tax, bank tax, estate tax. What we need to establish is a bank of reconstruction. Not a private bank, but a public utility. Turn the banks into public utilities. And out of that, public sector investments in green technology to transform the economy and end poverty. More than a fiscal stimulus, what we need is a transformation of economic power. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Our next panelist is Dan Lett. Some of you might recognize him as the political columnist who writes for the Winnipeg Free Press. Dan?
It seems a little ass backward to be opening up my laptop to show me something that you're not going to be able to see, but my printer wasn't working. So this is the best I could do. I want to read you a little something that I dug up. I'm going to have to change some of the words here so you get the punchline. It is the violence within our society that encourages some people to make bad things in the first place. It is the same violent society that makes some people believe that they can change those bad people and the violence by use of a bomb. As the great American pacifist A.J. Musk said, there is no way to peace, peace is the way. In 1982, I was just in my first year at Carleton University, and I happened to be, I'm from Toronto originally, and I happened to be plugged in with a lot of people that I still consider to be quite courageous agents for social justice that were involved in the anti-nuke movement. I mean, that was really the cause back in the early 1980s. If you spend any time reading current affairs coming out of high school and going to university, that was really your cause. I hooked up with some people through Project Plowshares and the Quakers. It was a lot of faith-based movement at that time. And you know, the big gig at that time was protesting outside Litton Systems in Toronto. Now, this is, some of you are nodding, so I'm glad I'm not the oldest guy in the room. Litton Systems, you'll still see their POS systems in restaurants, and why don't they make cash registers, microwave ovens, and they also made the guidance system for the cruise missile. So, you know, back in 1982, the cruise missile was sort of the dark lord of the new sort of generation of weapons that was coming through. There were the Trident submarines. They launched cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. We were all scared shitless, for good reason, as it turned out. And so every year, twice a year, once in August and once in April, people would come and they would protest outside of Litton's. And it was because it was faith-based, it was entirely peaceful. It was, you know, the epitome of nonviolent protest, and it was very professional and competent, I might add. And so for years this went on, up until October 1982. And in October 1982, 5 people who called themselves Direct Action packed 300 kilograms of dynamite into a van, parked it outside Litton Systems, and blew the front of the building off, and seriously injured 10 people. So I bring this up as sort of context, first of all, for what happened in Toronto, and with you know, a nod to some of my earlier panelists about the debate about kinds of protest, and why you should be concerned about the kind of protest, and why it is, quite frankly, a very important debate to have if you consider yourself a fan of social justice. What happened between pre-bomb and post-bomb was quite dramatic. Pre-bomb, we were allowed right up onto the front steps. I mean, like, it was really fashionable in those days for women in particular, and I think it's because of their higher pain threshold, would come with ketchup bottles full of their own blood. And they would pour some on their head, and then they would run up to the front doors and squirt it all over the windows. And it was, you know, it was a dramatic TV moment. You know, it was something designed for TV. And at that time, television news was exploding as the, you know, the next medium. Of course, nobody saw the internet coming along. But anyways, so TV was it. After the protest, you know, the cops didn't have as much of a sense of humor. You know, the protest that we went at, we were organized into groups. There were people there who were there to get arrested, and there were people like me who were there to follow them once they got arrested. And those people who got arrested were not treated well. We were cordoned off. We were like contained by you know, 2,000-pound police horses stomping around all over the place. There was tear gas. There was you know, people getting whacked over the head with billy clubs. So, you know, one of the important things you got to remember when you're looking at Toronto is that there's nothing unprecedented about what happened in Toronto. This is cause and effect, and for anybody who's been involved in social justice or political activism for years, you got to know this stuff has been going on forever. In the debrief on our Lytton mission, you know, there were people there, you know, that were quite upset about the fact that they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom for 6 hours, that they were held without charge for 2 days. And these, you know, these are important things. But there was also like some 40 and 50-year-old people there who've been doing it since Vietnam, who told stories about how they used to go and do sit-ins in the alcove to the U.S. Embassy when it was on Wellington, right across from the House of Commons. And they'd get the crap beat out of them, and they'd throw them in the paddy wagons and take them to the cops' house, and they'd beat the crap out of them again. So, you know, really, you know, analyze what happened in Toronto with a critical eye, but don't confuse it with unprecedented. You know, like, I've gone on from sort of, you know, my social activism days into journalism, and I like to think it makes a good transition. You know, for me, the cause, and I don't know how this happened, has been wrongful convictions. So I've written 6 wrongful conviction exposés, and 4 men, I've helped free 4 men from jail. So to me, that's social justice. But the one thing I've sort of learned is that the medium is the message. I mean, anybody who thinks that that's become an outdated concept is not paying attention to the new media age that we're in. You know, why did the conservatives overreact? Absolutely, I have no disagreement with what the previous panelists said. I may not subscribe to all the hyperbole, but the analysis of the most important issues there, absolutely true. The fact that a good portion of the public and the media were distracted by a small, well, not ultra-violent, but a violent component, absolutely distracted. But the medium is the message. And you can't just sort of, you know, look at what happened in Toronto and not know, or not look critically at why it happened. Why did they overreact? Well, they overreacted because, you know, people I think I like to call anarchy tourists spent 6 months on social networking sites talking about how they were going to throw bricks through the Gap windows on Queen Street. Now, you know, it wasn't Tiananmen Square, right? It was never going to be Tiananmen Square. And yes, the conservatives overreacted, and they wasted a lot of money, and they made us look like fools. But, you know, at a certain point in time, the people who were involved in the protest have to own the way the protest goes. Back in my day, a long time ago, you know what? There was an entire component of the protest that did nothing else but go through and try to find people who weren't on the same page. Now, you know, you can call that a 60s kind of approach, or a 70s approach, or an 80s approach, but they were concerned about how the protest was being conducted because they understood this was their platform to get their message across. I think that the media and the general public and the protesters have to kind of share culpability for, you know, throwing, you know, smoke and flame and broken glass and distracting people from the real issues that were involved, which the 2 previous panelists are absolutely articulately described. Those are the core issues. Now, there were tens of thousands of words written about those issues in major newspapers in this country. There were hours of discussion and videotape about those issues. However, the lead-in to almost all of that stuff was a picture of a burning police car. Now, I think it is important to debate whether that's productive for the movement. You know, I think, you know, personally, I'm still singing off the nonviolent protest songbook. I think, you know, did it have the effect that we wanted it to? I don't know that anybody can say. Lytton Systems stopped making guidance systems for the cruise missile in 1993, not because of what a coalition of peace groups called the Cruise Missile Conversion Project, but because the Canadian dollar and a depressed U.S. economy made it, you know, not profitable anymore to make the guidance systems. As a journalist, I can tell you that the people in power become steeled, a deeper resolve to do what they did in Toronto every time somebody throws one brick through a Starbucks window. So yes, it's their overreaction, but at some point as well too, I think the protesters kind of have to own this thing, and they have to kind of take ownership of whether or not people are getting the message. Globalization is a really tough thing to protest because there's all kinds of different things that you could sort of go after there. And that's another problem with the movement, is that it's not one movement, it's a whole bunch of different movements. And I don't know how you resolve that, but protest in large part is public relations. And that's not to dispute the worthiness of direct action, but in the gross majority of people that are out there listening to what's going on in Toronto, if they are important to the final solution of achieving social justice, then what are they seeing? And if you're not concerned about what they're seeing, then I don't know how you can be concerned about sort of whether or not it's actually going to change anybody's mind.
Thank you, Dan. I saw the panelists furiously scribbling during their speech, so I think we might allow for a short response period before we get to the Q&A for the panelists to respond to each other's speeches. Our next panelist is Joan Grace, who is an associate professor at the University of Winnipeg, where she teaches Canadian politics. Joan?
With being the fourth on the list, because everything that's been said, I want to say, has been said. However, let me just begin my comments by saying that I disagree with you, David, in little bits, although we probably really frankly don't disagree all that much at the end of the day, and I totally agree with you, Dan, although I think protest is more than public relations. My comments are really reflective of my experiences being surrounded by, hey, my time of life, okay? I'm surrounded by seniors and elderly people, because I have aged parents, okay? And during the G20 protests, we're like, this is an outrage. This is appalling. How do these people do this? This is terrible, right? So I am here to talk about the legitimacy of expressive politics and disruptive politics as being a function, and frankly as being a democratic right in a liberal democracy, a Western liberal democracy. And indeed, many before us have struggled to have the right to engage in lawful discontent in collective politics. So how do I see disruptive or expressive politics? Well, I see it as collective action that is designed, it's purposely designed to provide voice and make public issues that are outside the conventional vehicles of lobbying and electoral politics, because individuals are not heard, these groups are not heard for those conventional processes, and ultimately to affect change, social change, economic change, and to, frankly, also create instability within the system and to realign power structures. I mean, this is the purpose of expressive disruptive politics. And some of you, I'm going to just take a wild guess, have probably engaged in some of this disruptive expressive politics, and that can be anything from signing a petition to boycotting, right? It can be anti-swoosh, or live your life as being organic and fair trade, right? To engaging in lawful protests. And indeed, in a democratic society, disruptive politics is frankly rightful and has a justifiable role to play. So I'm making the case here that collective action, disruptive politics, expressive politics is an important function of liberal democracy. Protest politics is certainly not public relations because it is about expressing discontent. It is about a politics in which, frankly, in large modern governments, which many of us do not have access to policymakers, to decision makers. So frankly, to get voice, to be heard, to realign, to get a different discourse out there, a different way of thinking, an alternative perspective, we frankly have to engage in some forms of public mass politics. So it's certainly much more than public relations. And in fact, it has a function to play within a liberal democracy, right? It's functional within the process of our governance system. Protesters act as an intermediary between civil society and government, or governmental officials. We can hold government to account in that kind of protest activity. I'm using the kind of rural we here. We can educate the public, the media. We can try to shift attitudes, change, ultimately that's the goal. We can bring to light pressing policy issues, public issues. And frankly, at the end of the day, cast issues through a different light, different lens, and through a different discourse, a critique, a thinking. So protest activity is a legitimate form of citizens to engage in sort of participation or engagement within their system. And indeed in Canada, we see protest activity increasing. In fact, more Canadians join groups to engage in collective politics than they do in political parties. Now this tells you something. This is important, all right? Very, very few Canadians join political parties. Many Canadians join groups. And many of those groups are social movement organizations of all different kinds. Between 1981 and 2000, protest activity actually went up 11%. Now, I looked for more comparable current data, but I'm going to throw a sort of a hypothesis out there and say that probably has increased even still under our current government. And I think we can sort of point to the prorogation of Parliament as an example. Because Canada is typically a country which is characterized as being quasi-participant. Canadians typically, historically, have not been a get outside, into the streets and protest kind of people, but increasingly are. Certainly, the sort of Generation X is. So during the battle for Seattle, and I want to go back there because I think this is an important sort of starting point. I mean, that to me is arguably the catalyst for what we know to be the anti-globalization movement of today, the G20, the protests that took place in June in Toronto. And really sort of I think that is a hallmark of understanding that sort of large anti-globalization, or if you want to put it in, sort of more positive term, pro-democracy movement. We need to, I think, sort of go back to that. And just briefly, one protester said at the time that, is sort of looking at the protest during for the Battle of Seattle, this is what democracy looks like, right? And I believe people were making themselves sort of public and known and trying to ultimately have an effect on the political agenda. And frankly, they did have some effect. So why are they protesting? Well, they're protesting because, protesters, Canadian citizens of the world, feel powerless to these international organizations, these informal gatherings of G8 and G20, which frankly are not informal, right? These are highly organized, formalized entities that have a lot of power, that exert and wield a lot of power, that have outcomes in our domestic policies, but we have no way to have any kind of democratic participation in these organizations. So, it's not surprising that many seek to a public sort of mass politics. And they also know that mass politics protests work. I mean, think about history here, right? The French Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, the Winnipeg General Strike, the Orange Revolution. Mass politics works. Not always, but mass politics works. So, it's not, again, surprising that they would gather and protest. And ultimately, they do this because there's a very entrenched international consensus around liberalization of trade, and this has been talked about by the panelists. Understanding that on the part of the protester that G8 and G20, although less G20 certainly, international organizations with WTO and NAFTA and World Bank, which of course are embodied and all part of the sort of international consensus of the G8. Exert corporate crime, right? The protester, to their thinking, and as a protester said this in 1999 after Seattle, you have to kill capitalism before it kills you. So, it comes from a very strong sense of anger. And I think it's further fueled by, frankly, we're talking Toronto here, by an incredible lack of discontent, and that's put mildly, on the part of Canadians with regards to their current Harper government. We don't feel represented. We don't feel we have substantive input into our government. And after all, our current government is one in which, and this is getting a lot of media play right now, as it should, silences critics, right? It has constrained access to information. It has closed the policy system to civil society input. It devises agendas that make no sense, like women's health in developing countries, which excludes reproductive rights. I mean, this is ludicrous, right? So at the end of the day, just to conclude, my time is coming to an end here. Expressive politics, disruptive politics is a legitimate role to play within a liberal democracy, and certainly in all countries, I would say. But I think more indeed in a modern liberal democracy, because it's a way for us to be able to engage and to have a voice and to disrupt conventional entrenched institutional practices and thinking. But is this justification for violent activity? And ultimately, this is one of the most important questions. Disruptive politics is one thing. Smashing windows and setting cars on fire is quite another. I suppose you can ask yourself a couple of questions I think that are really important here. What does violent activity, such as that perpetrated by anarchists or the Black Scars, or whatever they call themselves now, what does that achieve, right? Is it an appropriate and legitimate strategy to destabilize the international economic consensus? Is this an effective way to get the attention of civil society and policymaker, or does it further alienate individuals towards the political system? Have violent protests, are these responsible? I mean, I'm talking previous ones, for city lockdowns now, and they have now impeded any kind of engagement or dialogue between government authorities and civil society. And I think this is something that that I agree with Dan on, that protesters have to take, I think, a hard look here. I tend to lean towards a position that violent activity is not an option, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. And our final panelist is Chris Powell, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Manitoba.
Okay, I'm going to have to make this up completely. I can't give the talk I was going to give. I want to cram some other things in that are in there. Okay. Can you let me know when I've got 5 minutes? Can you do like jazz hands or something? So, one of the questions that I thought might be more on the table than it is the question of whether we are looking at in Canada the criminalization of dissent. We see police practices like the preventative detention of perceived activist leaders on trumped-up charges, people getting arrested in the middle of the night in their homes because they're part of some group. We see police officials lying about the law. In Toronto, people were told that if you went within 5 meters of the fence, you had to have your ID checked, and that was not actually legal. We're seeing the mass arrest of peaceful protesters as a retribution for acts committed by a handful of individuals. We're seeing verbal and physical intimidation of protesters and threats by police. Detained individuals report sexual harassment, police officers saying, I hope you get raped in jail, things like that. And when, upon release, police officers saying things like, well, we're going to be keeping our eyes on you. And we see perhaps the use of police plainclothes officers to incite or commit violence. We're not sure. It's happened in Canada before. It happened 3 years ago in Quebec. Quebec provincial police officers posing as protesters tried to incite a riot, and at Montebello, and union leaders spotted them and stopped them, and the QPP had to fess up. So, are we seeing the criminalization of dissent in Canada, or the recriminalization of it perhaps? I think so. So I'm going to talk about why I think that's happening, my own work, and then I'm going to talk about some of the responses to it. That's the part I'm cramming in that I didn't have before. So, and my work, I'm a historical sociologist. I look at things that happen over the span of hundreds of years. So I take a very big picture, for better or for worse. So, first of all, I want to consider why it is that people sometimes do have the right to protest and have their civil rights taken seriously by the police, even when they are engaged in a public power struggle with those same beliefs. And I think the fundamental reason always as to why states have to respect the rights of citizens is the relation of power, the balance of power between subjects and the sovereign authority of the state. When people are able to hold the state accountable when they're able to impose a cost or a penalty on the state for compromising their rights, then the state finds that it's better off respecting those rights. But when people aren't able to do that, then the state, or anybody else for that matter in this world, does what they can get away with. Well, I'm a little pessimistic, but hey. If we're seeing the recriminalization of dissent in Canada, it's because there's been a change in the balance of power between the government and its subjects. And I think the roots of that change in the balance of power are in the shifting dynamics of something that sociologists call the modern world system. The modern world system has two components. First, there's a global economy, the capitalist world economy, that everybody's a part of, that everybody's been a part of for the last 500 years, including the Soviet Union, which was a state monopoly capitalist state. And on the other hand, there's a pluralistic system of individually sovereign nation states. At least they're formally sovereign. And those two things together, the political system and the economic system, make up the modern world system, and it's been around for about 500 years. And it goes through periodic crises, economic crises, cyclically, and it went through one in the 1970s, and I'll get to that in a second. But from the end of the Second World War to the middle of the 1970s, so for about 30 years, from the mid-40s to the mid-70s, the dominant states in the world system saw their national economies grow steadily and quickly at a historically unprecedented rate. You had unprecedented economic growth, and that's sort of like, if you're my age, it's your parents' generation who lived kind of through that. That situation created opportunities for an interesting kind of politics that's come to define what progressive politics means in the privileged countries of the world. And it's a politics that works by saying, well, instead of using all this incredible wealth that we're creating just to benefit the people who already have wealth, let's use some of it to bring people into the system, to bring sort of disenfranchised groups into the table. And we could call that an expansive politics of inclusion. And it's a politics that was practiced by only a fraction of the dominant political elite in the dominant countries in the world. There were always members of the dominant political elite who didn't think that was a good idea, and there was a power struggle between the two segments of the dominant elite, and the progressive group gained a lot of ground because companies were making profits, and it was expedient to appease people who were protesting, who were demanding inclusion, who were demanding rights, who were demanding enfranchisement. It was expedient to appease them rather than allow them to disrupt this wonderful economic growth that was going on. So let's bring them into the table. But starting in the mid-1970s, the global world system went into a significant economic crisis from which it's never properly recovered. Thank you. Oh boy. Okay, so, and the rate of growth fell, declined. And it's been down. The last 30 years, the economy has grown more slowly than it did in the previous 30 years, quite substantially. And that means corporate profits fell, or they should have fallen. But what happened in the 1980s is the beginnings of what we're calling neoliberalization. Governments everywhere cut back on social programs, and not just welfare and direct spending, but also on the kinds of regulations that cut into corporate profits, like environmental regulations, for instance, or health and safety regulations. Or they gutted the enforcement agencies that enforced these, even though the regulations were still on the books, didn't mean anything. So, and that, in effect, what that did was transfer wealth back from the less privileged people who've been benefiting from this expansive inclusionary politics, transferred that wealth back to the minority of people at the very top of the system. So that transfer of wealth from poor to rich disguised the relative contraction of the rate of growth in the capitalist world economy. And there's not much digging left to do, although our government is doing everything it can to keep that process working. So what that meant in political terms was that there was less incentive then to appease people who were disenfranchised and angry and willing to go on strike and willing to protest and willing to block things up. Since there's less incentive to appease them, there's less accountability. And the long story short, that translates into increased impunity for police forces in Canada and other countries around the world to do what they like. And I'm fairly pessimistic. I think we're going to see continued expansion of police repression in Canada, regardless of what strategies the protesters adopt for the foreseeable future. I think we're in for some very hard times. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about what is happening, as I see it, in the big picture on the left. It responds to all of this, and there's three general approaches, general strategies. The first of these is rational or moral persuasion. And the second is what I'm going to call counter-hegemony. And the third is building the new world in the shell of the old. So the first strategy, morally or rationally persuading. If you assume that society is held together, and I'm not trying to pass judgment on any of these, by the way. If you assume that society is held together by some common norms of values, or by some common shared interest that constitutes a collective good, then the smart thing to do is to appeal to those shared norms and values, to appeal to that collective good, to engage in very controlled, symbolic forms of protest that communicate a clear message to the general public, to try to persuade Canadians in general of the value of a particular stance on a particular issue. So if you see society as basically an organic whole that's held together by either common public good or by common values, then that's what you should do. If, on the other hand, you see society as fundamentally irreconcilably divided by relations of domination, whether that's class relations, gender relations, patriarchy, or possibly others, you face a different terrain. You're not going to be able to rationally persuade the capitalists to lay down, their control of the wealth of society in his view. And on top of this, in top of the basic division between the dominant and the dominated, even those groups are not homogeneous, so that it's possible that different sectors of the dominant group and different sectors of the dominated groups struggle with each other over how things should go. And if that's your view of society, then the smart thing to do is to try to construct an alliance of all of the groups, of all of the class fractions that you think are going to be able to work with you. So you find the progressive liberals who are rich and, for whatever reason they want to be progressive, and you ally them with, labor unions, and you ally them with rainforest workers in Brazil, and you construct a great big alliance that's committed to a shared program that is trying to take over the institutions of society to push the direction of social development in a particular way. And that's what happens at, for instance, the World Social Forum. All these groups from around the world get together and try to hammer out a common agenda to some extent, because they're trying to construct this alliance. And then, if you're going to protest, your audience, I'm going to take 1 or 2 more minutes. Your audience, if you're having a big protest, your audience is not really the general public. Your audience is mainly other activists and other people around the world or around the country who are involved in struggle, and you're trying to show them, first of all, we're here, we're on the street, we're doing something, come, let's connect, let's talk, let's make deals, let's hammer something out. So that's the second strategy. The third one I'm just going to say a handful of words about is if you don't think that it's possible to take control of the existing institutions of society and steer society in a better direction, then your third option is what I call, well, I didn't make up this phrase, building a new world in the shell of the old. And whether you're whether you call yourself an anarchist or not, and then there's even a bit of overlap.
Oh, pleased to be here. I thought I was going to be late.
Whether you call yourself an anarchist or not, if you're trying to create alternative institutions that completely go around the existing ways of doing things, then you're engaged in that third strategy. And then, well, the politics of how you protest then are pretty complicated, but standing up to the cops in direct physical confrontation can be one way of trying to develop an alternative solution to the question of who controls the use of force in society and how it gets deployed. So I'm just going to leave it there. That's the huge question right now for left movements, is which of those three strategies is going to be the dominant one. Thanks a lot.
So I said that we could give some time for panelists to respond to each other, but then I thought maybe not. So I'm just going to take sort of a mood of the crowd sort of thing. So I'll ask first who wants to give 5 minutes to the panelists to respond to each other, and I'll say who would like to proceed directly to Q&A. Okay, so show of hands, who would like to give the panelists 5 minutes to respond to each other? Okay, and who would like to proceed directly to Q&A? Okay, so I think we'll do 5 minutes. If you could please keep your comments very pointed, directly to the point, and 5 minutes starts now.
I'll jump in, and since things I said seem to have drawn the disagreement of some of the other panelists at the front, I just want to restate and make a few points about this. Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I said is that people who support social justice, one of the things I said is that people who support social justice shouldn't get involved in this debate about protests being legitimate or illegitimate. Instead, I think we need to focus on a different question, which is what's the best strategy to fight neoliberal austerity and to fight for social change, and what are the tactics that can help us advance towards that strategy. So I'm not saying anything goes or everything goes or anything we do is as good as anything else, but I think there's a different debate to have than the one that's defined by the media and defined by government, which is about legitimate or illegitimate protest. And it's a different discussion. And I have some strong views on the question of strategy and tactics that some people in this room, might find very objectionable, but I think it's a different debate. And I wanted to explain this because if everyone had in the past accepted the limits of so-called legitimate protest, unions would have fewer no rights and access to abortion would still be restricted by the criminal code in Canada, just to give 2 examples. Frederick Douglass, the great African-American abolitionist and freedom fighter in the 19th century, said that power concedes nothing without struggle. I'm paraphrasing here. People who want change without struggle want the ocean without the roar of its mighty waters. In other words, if you really want social change, if you look at history, it's always going to involve forms of action that at that particular time are deemed illegitimate.
Okay, thank you, David. Anybody else?
Two comments in respect to some things that Dan said. One, does the media, after we hear about the burning car, actually have a full debate about the issues? And I would argue it doesn't. I'm an academic, and so what am I going to tell you? A book I just wrote. We just read tens of thousands of pages of the New York Times. It's a book called Gatekeeper, 60 Years of Economics According to the New York Times. And we looked at how the central bank operates. We looked at unemployment and inflation. And this is the New York Times, which is supposed to be more progressive. But we discovered, of course, the New York Times shapes the perspective. It does not allow a full range of debate. It treats Sweden badly. It treats the central bank under Greenspan, up until very recently, really remarkably well, in spite of what it did to wages and profits. And we would argue basically the New York Times' interest is some liberal, some conservative, but it's basically shaping the public opinion with respect to corporate profitability. It justifies overthrow of democratic governments. It does this over and over again over a long history. And I would say the Winnipeg Free Press, the National Post, the Globe and Mail are to the right of the New York Times. And so I don't think after you hear about the car burning, you actually do get a full debate. You get something quite different. And one more shot, Dan.
You're still way more polite than the people who write into my blogs.
But I'm also more informed.
Absolutely.
Which is, I guess, my other point, which is that to identify the Lytton protest, which is not unimportant, you basically suggest that we were being hyperbolic about what went on.
No,
This was a huge protest. This was $1.2 billion in government money. It's not the same thing, I would argue, as a particular protest that happened 20 years ago. That's trivializing what happened now, not to dismiss what happened.
For better or for worse, one of the great things about my job is I've been all over the world, and I've seen political systems in action in places where they don't have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, they don't have police complaint commissions. I don't think people who are in Toronto or Seattle, for that matter, really want to hear about the differences. I mean, the protest at Lytton system, that was just sort of, one example. I'd like to hear more maybe after the session about how, really one of the seminal protest movements in North American history. And I should go back. I was somewhat cynical about the impact of the protest movement, but 3 consecutive US presidents and 3 consecutive Canadian prime ministers, among other world leaders, eventually agreed in the late 80s and into the 90s to look at nuclear non-proliferation treaties. And you know, that's like moving the mountain. You know, because the hysteria that led to nuclear proliferation in the 70s and 80s was about as divisive an issue as you could possibly get. And it pitted capitalists against socialists, it pitted corporate America against labor unions. It was an all-encompassing subject. I don't know how instructive Lytton is, but it's certainly not trivializing. But you know, what I learned from Lytton was that protest, what I consider to be the most effective form of protest, is an act of sacrifice. It's putting yourself in harm's way to make a point, to communicate a message to people who don't have the intestinal fortitude to come out and stand on the front line with you. That to me is effective. I was in Manila when Fidel Ramos, who was at that time was the president of the Philippines, suggested that he would do away with term limits, which was one of the great sort of constitutional amendments that came out of the People Power Revolution led by Corazon Aquino. And the day after he said that, 1 million people showed up in a plaza in downtown Philippines, led by Corazon Aquino. And Fidel Ramos never brought up the issue of ending term limits ever again. The People Power movement in the Philippines, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement is probably the most instructive about about the use of nonviolent protest. And this is where I'll engage in some hyperbole. But how would it have changed if civil rights activists began stringing up rednecks in Mississippi? If they began to respond to the violence that they were subjected to every day? I think that we can agree, although nobody knows what the outcome would be, that it would be different. And you would not have had Lyndon B. Johnson, and I just saw this video or this movie the other day, Lyndon Johnson standing in the White House with African Americans signing edicts forcing schools in the South to integrate. You know, they did that non-violently, and I don't think bringing up examples of people who looked at protests as an act of sacrifice in any way trivializes what happens in Toronto. I think it's something that everybody should be. If you want to be a protester, you want to be an activist, I think you owe it to the people who came before you to look at what they did.
Thank you, Dan. I'd like the 2 remaining panelists, if you could respond to Dan's point, which I believe was we have it relatively not so bad, so we shouldn't be so upset. I think that's maybe part of what you were getting at.
I think we should just take it, put it into context of the struggles that people have in other parts of the world.
So, either the 2 panelists remaining would like to respond to that.
I think you're being very dictatorial on that. Chris?
All right.
I want to come back to David.
Sure.
Go ahead.
It's a free country.
It is a free country. Yeah, thank you very much.
It was a suggestion.
David, we do not disagree. We do not disagree, and I do not take objection to what your points were. I completely support what you have to say. My only point is that I think we need to, I know, we need to educate Canadians on the purpose and power of legitimate and disruptive politics. This is not representative of the average Canadian crowd, okay? And I don't think they actually fully appreciate the role that disruptive politics and expressive politics plays in a Canadian democratic system. That was my only point. I just don't take any objections to what you had to say. I support you.
Well, the thing that I'm going to say is that when we argue about tactics, like violent protest or non-violent protest or direct action versus educating people and so on, tactics have their place in a larger context of strategies, of an overall vision of a sense of what the goals are of the movement, what it's fighting for, and generally how it tries to fight. And a strategy has behind it a sense of what society is and how it works. So when we have different ideas about what society is and how it works, like is society a moral community? Is society an exploitative capitalist order? Like these are fundamentally different conceptions of what society is and how it works. It leads us to different strategies and to different tactics. When we have one group protesting one issue, that's fine. The group can pick its tactics and its strategy. But when we have a mass convergence of many, many groups, like in the G20, the difficulty is that some of the strategies and some of the tactics cancel each other out. And so far, it's fascinating, because so far there's been this incredible sort of collective not addressing the issue that it goes under the name of diversity of tactics. So you'd be over there marching with picket signs and babies and looking over your hair, you know, in clown suits, you know, throwing flowers at the cops, and then someone will be down the street, you know, trashing Starbucks. We're all going to do that, and that's all fine. And everybody knows that those strategies all cancel each other out to some extent. And I think before too much longer, debates like the one we're starting to have at this table over, you know, which of those tactics is appropriate are going to get more intense within left movements. And left movements with more mainstream purchase are going to start to debate within themselves whether they should be policing the more radical elements, and that's going to get really interesting.
Thank you very much, Panelists. Okay, so now it's the Q&A session. So just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, please line up behind the microphone there. Keep your questions short and concise, and you can direct your questions to any individual panelist or the panel in general. Don't all run up at once.
Hello, my name is Grant Sherpack. I don't really represent anyone but myself. I spent a lot of time in this library. I've studied the Canadian Constitution, I've read the National Defence Act, I've read the Criminal Code, I've read a lot of law, constitutional law, and what I saw in Toronto was a judo throw. Our opponents used our inertia against us. What we have to do is go back to basics and learn the rules, because if we want to protest, we have to know the rules of protest and how to use them to our advantage. We're mentioning people getting arrested at night. Well, if you really understand the criminal code, citizens of Canada can arrest people in the middle of night. It doesn't have to be a police officer. It's wonderful reading. So there's all kinds of rules that you can use in the law to really protest and create ways, and if you get the media involved and the internet involved, you can really affect change. Tear down the system, rebuild it, and you know, use safe work procedures. Thank you.
Dave Sauer with Winnipeg Labour Council. Just a question for Dan, and I don't mean to pillory the journalists here tonight, but just a question about
inviting other journalists.
Absolutely,
that's covered.
But I think one of the things I just wanted some clarification on is you said globalization is a difficult thing to actually protest. Where I'm not entirely convinced of that. I think in large part what the protests have been able to do is they've done the education part. Largely before 1999, who knew about the WTO? Most people had no idea. The free trade area of the Americas I consider a success story in that it has been defeated, or at least largely delayed, and it's been relegated to only the individual trade pacts between countries now. So I see that as a success, and how it can actually reflect what's going on in countries like Brazil and Argentina and so on and so forth. I think what makes the anti-globalization movement actually more of a strength is that it is that diverse. It has that ability to prod and poke at this from a variety of different directions. I mean, the workers in Inco, they know it's Valley and go from Rio de Janeiro. This is not some Canadian company to be able to rely. So I just wanted a bit of a clarification on that. Because from my perspective, I think it is effective in that it is able to prod. We lost maybe the media battle in the G20, but it's still one more step. I mean, this is a long process that we're going to be going through.
I think my fellow panelists actually said it more articulately than I did. That was the point I was trying to make. about the convergence of different movements with different agendas and different tactics. Although, one thing I would sort of, if you don't mind, it's not a rhetorical question, but you know, one of the things I'm tracking right now, I'm just fascinated by is, you know, union organization and strike and protest in Chinese factories. So, no, I would ask you, you know, be frank. Do you think that Chinese workers are at all influenced by what happens in Seattle or Toronto, or are they just kind of waking up to the fact that they've become the dumping ground for low-skill jobs around the world? I mean, like it's going to change the paradigm of international commerce. What's going on in China, and it's, I hate the term because of the people who use it, but it's a grassroots, it's a community thing. It's right from the bottom up. It's like the back end of the Industrial Revolution going on right now. It's fascinating. But I don't know that, personally, I don't know that we can credit, you know, the G8, G20, you know, anarchist stuff, or even the more articulate protests as having been responsible for that. But maybe you've got, maybe you know if there's something else I'm missing.
Well, no, like what I would argue is that is part and parcel of it. I mean, the fact is that we have workers here that are dealing with these international globalizations. So that's what I mean by the prod and poke. I mean, if we're solely focusing on that protest is only a right that is here within this window of North America, I think we're being pretty naive with that. So I think it's something, the ability that every, you know, workers in general will realize. You know, have they realized they're being the dumping ground? Yeah, I mean, there's 10,000 protests a year that are suppressed by the Chinese government. So it is something that is actually, they are rising up. Now the problem is that the baton is a lot bigger over there, and it's typically a barrel of a gun, whereas we have the media here, which does help avoid being that as well. I mean, nobody was killed in G20. I've been told by people in this former Soviet Union, they would have had bodies all over the street. So I mean, there is that difference that we do have where the media does play. It does help protect us in some sort of fashion from, you know, excess beatings of sorts, or from time, well, you know, I'm trying to give you a little bit of credit.
Hi, I'm Brian. I guess my question is mainly for Joan, but I guess everyone can kind of chime in on this. You know, I like what Chris said about like the three different conceptions of how society operates, and I tend to lean more towards the second and pretty far away from the first. So it seems to me that in a lot of our protest tactics, especially on the kind of, you know, mainstream, social democratic, progressive, whatever terms left, and you know, I have some background in the student movement, so I see this kind of thing often. We tend to go for the purely something, you know, no disrespect to all my friends in the student movement, but we tend to go for things that are very symbolic and often don't really have any serious confrontation or exert any real power. And in a lot of ways, we put our impotence on display in terms of, say, gathering a few hundred people to go yell at a building and listen to speeches and then go home. You know, that doesn't particularly threaten a lot of politicians. You know, not that I would say it's the politicians who really particularly changed society, but I'm just wondering, and I know you've mentioned like disruptive politics, and it seems to me that like a lot of the things that you've put under that umbrella aren't particularly disruptive, and I don't know, it seems to me that really at the end of the day, at some point we gotta start fucking shit up because the world's fucked.
Okay. I disagree. Although I intellectually, academically, most certainly academically, and most certainly intellectually, I appreciate where you're coming from, obviously. Because there's a lot of anger, and frankly there should be a lot of anger. Corporate crime is real. And it is exactly what it says, it's crime. There's a lot of people suffering around the world, economically, socially, culturally, environmentally, and that's at the hands of corporate profits, of which, frankly, all of us who live in Western liberal democracies have reaped the benefits of that, right? So there's a lot of anger. To say it's just frustration is putting it very mildly. So intellectually, I see that. But I wonder if in thinking about G20 or G8 protests, have we, and I've been part of the student movement. I've been out there doing my thing and yelling and screaming and holding placards, and I actually think that has a role to play. I've been part of very, very few, I wouldn't even call them violent protests, but certainly protests that have led to some stuff going on that was a bit disconcerting. But nonetheless, it's all part and parcel, I think, of a general sort of real, genuine anger towards the system and political authorities and economic authorities. But when we talk about G20 and G8, I think we've come to a moment in which governments, political leaders, and I agree with Dan here, know that there's going to be incredible mass confrontation. And so they completely lock down the system, the city, completely lock down the whole process. They leave some room for demonstrations to get the voice out there, but ultimately it's not going to actually lead to any kind of beneficial outcome. And that's only because G20 and G8 protests after protests after protests, and we've all seen these. I mean, let's be frank with each other here, right? Have led to the same thing over and over and over again. Many people said that they really feel sorry for Toronto because they know exactly what's going to happen. A, B, C, D, and E, end, right? And that's exactly what happened. A, B, C, D, end. I'm not going to downplay the police brutality, which I think is real. I'm not downplaying that at all. And I want to be really clear about that and the corruption around civil rights. I'm not downplaying that one iota. But at the end of the day, I think we really have to take a hard and fast look at what ultimately is the outcome of these kind of activities. And although I appreciate the anger and the frustration.
And Joe, I was wondering if you could respond to the gentleman's question. He asked if you could sort of expand on your idea of disruptive politics and what you see as disruptive and what those things are disrupting.
All right, well, I mean, disruptive might be for some of those elements of politics I talked about, maybe more unconventional, perhaps. I mean, I teach Canadian politics, right? I teach students, undergrad students, who think about taking political activity as voting. Well, that's the minimal thing you can do is political engagement. So if they sign a petition or a boycott, I sort of applaud them for actually taking the next step, right? Canadians are actually largely complacent. You're not, but you're not the average Canadian, okay? You really need to be aware of this. And you're sort of talking to yourselves over and over and over again. You're already persuaded. You don't need any further persuading. Who needs persuading is the 52-year-old who lives in Lethbridge, right? Okay? Or the 49-year-old who lives in Trois-Rivières, or the 32-year-old who lives in Chatham, New Brunswick. And this is really crucial, and you are missing the boat if you don't get on that. Those are the individuals you need to target, and Canadians are ripe for this right now. This government, talk about being effed up, this is the government, okay, that is getting Canadians really seriously thinking about governance and their government. I mean, the prorogation debates alone, right? Now, it's many things, and it's sort of that passive internet, oh yeah, I'm going to go up there and protest, right? They don't really actually go and protest, they just say they will on Facebook. But a lot of people actually did, right? Canadians I think, are beginning to be more ripe for this, right? So I think you need to expand your horizons here a little bit, and one way not to get there is to use the old, sort of adage around, sticking it to the man. You need to think about ways that you can reach that public, frankly. So disruptive politics for a lot of Canadians signing the petition is actually kind of disruptive to them. It frankly is. It may not be to you, but it is to them. And so just think about that.
Hi, I'm Evan. I've got two quick questions, one for Robert and one for Chris. I'll start with the one from Chris. Out of the three competing conceptions of society and their corresponding strategies, which do you subscribe to? He's a professor of mine, I'm allowed to do this.
Well, actually, you're not.
Well, let me put it this way. I don't take the first one very seriously. The second one, no offense to those of you, but the question between the second and the third, I think, is the big question that's been on the table for the radical left for the last 150 years. And the 20th century was the time of the counter-hegemony in Western countries as the dominant strategy. I think there's a lot of reason to think that this played out. So I'm somebody who is skeptical of anarchist discourse, some of its romanticism, but I do think the long-term solution is going to be building a new world, and that's one of the fundamental elements of that is going to be building non-commodified ways of producing and distributing the material things that we need in our existences. There'd be so little of that. We've been so completely sucked into commodifying everything down to the point where now we commodify, drinking water routinely. To reverse that is enormous, but I think there's also a lot of potential, because right now there's a massive, in all the first world countries, there's a massive layer of people who are trying to live the middle class suburban dream, 2 cars and a big TV and a house in the suburbs, where you have to spend money just to move. And all of those people are to their ears in debt, and they're all worried about losing their jobs. And that's, I think, why at the moment they're defensive, and they're among, like 73% of Torontonians in an Angus Reid poll said they felt that police actions in Toronto at the G20 were justified. And I think that's coming from, a lot of that is coming from that defensive, I've got to hold on to what I've got mentality. So I agree that there's a tremendous opportunity and necessity for people engaged in the struggle to tap into that and somehow connect with those people.
Great, thanks. And my second question is for Robert. Could you just flesh out the alternative that you envision if we could move in that direction? I know you started with the taxation policy change.
Yeah, I think a better world is possible. I think we need to take some very particular economic positions. And so one of the ideas I threw out was a bank of reconstruction. What a bank of reconstruction was use tax money from financial tax, bank tax, estate taxes, corporate taxes, and build a public alternative. And what the bank of reconstruction would do is spend its research money on new technologies and retrofitting hospitals and homes and businesses. I would build new crown corporations to produce drugs, as opposed to allowing American corporations to produce these drugs, which of course is what's driving our healthcare costs more than anything else. I won't get into sustainability of the healthcare system. So we need a public sector alternative to the private sector and its commodification. All the rest of the debate, is you can have this discussion all you want. They have control, and none of this debate so far has contained their control, not as long as Harper or the liberals are in power in this country. And Obama has done almost nothing in the United States to reverse that. And so the real question is, how do we gain control? And, the discussion about whether the press is going to protect our democracy. A long history of this country is being involved in labor unions, being involved in social movements. If you want to prevent commodification of water, why don't you should join the Council of Canadians, because the Council of Canadians is talking about water as a human right. Conversation is one thing, protest in the streets, but how do we stop some of the free trade agreements, the MIA? It was the Council of Canadians that did that. Right now there's a Canadian, European Union negotiation over trade going on. And if that happens, it's NAFTA on steroids. We'll lose much more control over procurement, whether we can have local economic development, whether we'll be able to control our environment, although the Europeans do have higher environmental standards than we do. And so the question is, we can debate tactics, we can talk about issues, but history, we didn't get our universal healthcare system because the press advocated it, or the corporations advocated it. We had a political movement behind it and fought it in spite of the press. and in spite of the corporations, and in spite of the state in many places. And if we want to, turn the world into something like our universal healthcare system, we better organize, we better get involved in the organizations that are actually see the world in a way different from commodification, and often different way in which the media portrays that debate.
The organizers are going to run.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm a member of the Winnipeg Socialist Group. I just had a brief comment and follow-up question to that. Now, I guess in response to some of the comments about legitimate versus non-legitimate and violent versus non-violent, a friend of mine likes to use the reference point of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King as an example of legitimate versus non-legitimate, or violent versus non-violent, however you want to put it. And uses the quote, I forget where it comes from, excuse me, but essentially it says, it's from King, saying that if there was no Malcolm X, I would never be successful, meaning that if there wasn't somebody pushing through the margins, even the much more moderate efforts of social change would never be as successful. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind when we talk about different styles of protesting and casting aspersions on one another, that sort of thing. But which leads me to my question, which is, when it comes right down to it, we've been talking a lot about different styles of protesting and this sort of thing, but I think the kicker is that we still don't have a way to decide how we want our protests to turn out. I think there's people from a lot of different political camps that would like to see different things happen with the movements that we have. And I think the question for me is, how do we mediate those questions? How do we decide what we want our movements to look like? How do we get to the point where we want to be that doesn't involve the left eating itself?
I want to bring up, I worked in Ottawa in the 1990s covering Parliament Hill, and people can debate how influential it was, but the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which I guess prior to Jean Grace becoming Prime Minister, was still a somewhat fledgling organization, as a national organization. It had a fantastic Winnipeg and University of Manitoba, University of Winnipeg presence, so it was a constant source of information for us. But about 1994, the Centre for Policy Alternatives convinced Paul Martin that they would become one of the handful of groups that got to sit down and present a formal pre-budget analysis for consideration by the finance minister. And as I said, going through program review and some of the other things that happened, I mean, we'd spend an entire other evening debating the social justice in Paul Martin's budget, so maybe it might be a short conversation for y'all. But to me, there was something really elegant about what the Centre did, and basically in a very short period of time, and using very legitimate tactics, boardroom politics, for lack of a better term, they were able to get the ear of the finance minister. And as I said, we can sort of debate the impact of that. But I have friends that are economists who work for the Canadian Labour Congress, and they've tried for years and weren't able to do it. So I don't know what the Centre did specifically. No one's ever told me the story. But I think there are people working on elegant solutions to the problem. I don't think that makes what the Centre did in I don't know, some might accuse them of being co-opted. I kind of thought what they did, it was one of the best things that I saw when I was in Ottawa.
If I can actually tell you the story then, Dan,
There you go.
do I have a minute? I was co-chair of the alternative federal budget one year, and I was involved with it many years, and we did eventually get an audience, I didn't go, with Paul Martin. But the Globe and Mail would never ever publish any of our alternative federal budget, and we balanced budgets, and we did, we created in some ways co-opted, a quite legitimate sort of process. We had our economics tested by econ, but basically we never got into the Globe and Mail. Paul Martin saw us as a sort of a polite invitation. Never basically cut welfare spending, we call program spending, down to 50-year lows. in spite of the fact that we generated more economic growth than he did with our policies by any econometric evidence, and he basically ignored us. And why did we get the audience? I don't think we got the audience because it was elegant, although of course we were elegant because we had lots of brilliant economists doing this, right? Like me. But we had a grassroots movement, and as you mentioned, in Winnipeg we had choices. And so we were in the streets, and we were doing teach-ins around the country. And eventually it became more difficult for us to be ignored, and we had the labor movements behind us who were providing funding for this. We'd sit around a table, and there'd be 25 organizations, and they would go out and talk to them. And so there was a grassroots movement behind the elegance. 4 economists in a room is not ever going to get an audience from, we've never gotten an audience from Paul Martin. It's because it was a political movement, a political organization. And although we did get an audience, we were ignored, but you're right, we at least had to be heard.
A quick response to the question that was asked. I mean, if anybody had an answer to that question really about how the left can get itself together and not eat itself in the process, then we'd be further ahead than we are. But I do want to say one or two things, and that's that for people who are committed to trying to stop the austerity agenda and move in a direction of progressive social change, however you identify yourself, those of us who fall in the serious left have to first of all realize that people with just different points of view within that broad framework of agreement are not the enemy. There's way too much infighting and internal bitterness within the left that we need to get over. It doesn't mean we don't have debate, but it's got to be on the understanding about, we have to know which side are we on, right? The people who we're really, really concerned about are the people who are going to be inflicting the big cutbacks, the employers who are going to be cutting jobs, and the police who are going to be committing acts of brutality and so on against people. And then for people who are opposed to that right-wing agenda, we need to be able to be not, as Chris said, eat ourselves. We need to be able to have that sense of unity, but within that, to get more mature about how we have discussion and debate. And I just want to pick up on what Chris at the end of the panel said. We need to be able to actually not just say, you do my thing, you do your thing, I do my thing, call this diversity of tactics. That's a way often of avoiding debate about tactics. We need to actually have discussions about what strategies will be effective and what tactics will move us forward towards that. We need to create opportunities for people to come together and discuss those things, whether they're involved in student groups, unions, community organizations, or what have you. And we need to do that while we're actually taking action against the austerity that I want to underline is really going to be coming down in the coming years.
My name is Giselle, and I'd like to respond to some of those points in my comments. I think that I understand the violent protesters when they say that, what the states are doing sometimes are far more violent and criminal. And in a way, when I see Harper's position and the power he's used to circumvent the Copenhagen climate change conference, it's criminal when you see what's happening now in Pakistan. Like I think Canada and we have a responsibility as citizens, but especially this government. So I'm hoping that that they find a way that they can pay big bucks to repair the damage they're doing. But that aside, so I can appreciate the violence that they say. A brick somewhere here is not what is that compared to what's happening to so many people? So to get that attention. But I don't really support it myself. I understand it, I'm saying. I don't support it. Well, I've been in a number of places, and I've appreciated various tactics. When I was at the 2001 Summit of the Americas, I really liked the protest where there's a symbolic piece to it, and some thought that also grabs attention. Like Jackie Singh and the catapulting of the teddy bears to the police and fence, eh? Thought that was kind of cute. And then I really appreciated José Bové and his tactics. The one, of course, he's famous for dismantling the McDonald's over in France. Like deliberately kind of saying, okay, at this time at 4 o'clock, we're going to be going and dismantling it, having all the tools, and then setting up a whole team to dismantle it. It wasn't violent, and it was very dramatic. And then when he was at the World Social Forum, I was surprised to see a front page where he was in a, cutting corn in a GMO field of Monsanto with, no police kind of at him. I found out that in Brazil it was illegal to have GMOs planted, and Monsanto was doing it anyway. So the fact that he was there kind of destroying their crop was not illegal after all. So just such cleverness, is stimulating and challenges, I think, people to pay attention and look at the basic values. So anyway, I'm just saying I appreciate those symbolic kinds of gestures. And with the creativity we all have, I really appreciate that we should converge and coordinate our efforts better.
I'd like to respond to that, actually, if I may. That comment shows something interesting about certain kinds of direct action tactics, which is that they're not for everybody. Not everybody is physically or psychologically or socially equipped to go toe-to-toe with the cops. And that's part of the hesitation I was expressing about anarchism a little while ago. Sometimes, like anarchism is like that really cool guy, who has great hair and does awesome shit that blows your mind, and then after a while you're like, what? He's kind of macho and pushy. And, so sometimes there's a hierarchy, a kind of unacknowledged status hierarchy of who's been the most confrontational that comes across there. But that being said, we would keep calling it violent protest, but it's important to note that that what we're talking about is property damage and not harm. And damage to property is very rich, very powerful institutions, and not harm to any actual physical human being. And that's a message that is getting completely lost in the media, which people may want to think about, but it's an important point.
Hi, I'm Brock. This is a quick question for Joan. I'm not sure if you touched it or if I just missed it. But when you said that everyone could see what's going to happen in Toronto with this protest, that it's going to be to see and that's what's happening. Yet, the government still chose Toronto as the location to have this meeting. Could you, I can't David touched on this at the beginning as Harper's showing his muscle. Could you touch on that, or have you touched on it? Just repeat what you said.
All I meant was that we know it's going to happen.
I understand, but
yeah, that's all
do you think there's a reason why he still chose Toronto?
Oh, there's all kinds of reasons why prime ministers want to have international events in their country, because Canada's a middle power, right? Canada's a country that doesn't exert itself into the stage as it once did during the so-called Pearson years and after that. So prime ministers, to voice themselves politically, hopefully at home, but mostly internationally, they like to hold these international events and be the hosts. So it's a very clear political tactic on the part of the prime minister. Hence the reason of spending so much money, but also because they know it's going to happen.
I think the question was specifically about not holding it in Canada, but holding it in downtown Toronto as opposed to a rural area or
I see.
military base.
Okay.
Well, that was addressed. To flex the muscles.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's Toronto's an international city now. It's one of the world cities. We've always wanted to have a world city in Canada. Toronto's it. I think again, it's a political, symbolic statement, but a very clear political strategy on the part of the prime minister and his government. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's to push the envelope of his impunity and the government's impunity, which is a legacy that he'll pass on even if the Conservatives get voted out of power and the Liberals take over. There was a massive protest in the streets of Toronto. The whole city was shut down. The cops came out in force. They arrested innocent people, subjected them to appalling conditions, and so far the polls are on Harper's side. So he's established a little more room for himself to maneuver.
Sorry, I'm going to kind of agree with what I think that was the essence of the question, which is I don't understand Toronto either. Because no matter how you look at it, it was a really unpopular event in a political market that the Conservatives, if they were on fire, nobody would throw them a fire extinguisher in downtown Toronto. It remains this you know, unnatural sort of bastion of liberalism with a bit of NDP interest thrown in. And you know, it never made sense to me about why they would want to do it in Toronto. I suppose, I think there was from a practical point of view, a misguided belief that they somehow had, it was easier to control in an urban environment than a rural environment. I mean, I know when the stories came out about it was essentially, part of it was, like, more of it was supposed to happen in a rural environment and then was moved to an urban environment. So I think there, you know, I think there was a lot of dumbass sort of presumption going on. But in the end, you know, it was destined to be, everywhere this event has been, it's been a nightmare for local government and for the people that decided to hold it there. I mean, I know that's a really secondary consideration, but, you know, I don't know if that's exactly what you're getting at, but Toronto didn't make any sense for a whole bunch of reasons.
73% sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, but you know, you have to go to the Toronto media and look at the comments there. Like, they may think the police, you know, misinformed. They may think that the police action was justified, but I mean, people are miserable. Did you see the class action suit? The $51 million class action suit? Yeah. You know, I think it's becoming a three-ring. It's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare for politicians at all three levels of government now.
And I just want to, you know, just last comments, and Robert jumped in. Mr. Harper does not do things that make sense. Necessarily. I mean, I'm serious about this. In a very political way, he does not do things that you would intend him to do, understanding ideological position of a conservative, capital C or small c. So it is perplexing in some regards. In some regards, it's not, because he sort of has a little bit of the, oh yeah, I will. Watch me. I will. And he does. I think he has taken a hit in the whole zone, slightly.
I disagree, if I can jump in. Because, I think there's two mistakes we can make about political leaders. One is to assume that they have no plan and no idea, and their actions are irrational. And the other mistake is to assume that they're omnipotent and that they foresee everything. I think Harper has a plan. I think it's also possible that he overreaches himself and he makes mistakes. So that's how I would read the situation.
You know, I'm a lot more comfortable talking about what the central bank is doing in the healthcare system, so we're all speculating here about this business. But, you know, when they held it in Cananas, they had almost no problems. He moved to Toronto because I think the Toronto population is a lost cause to him, probably in terms of any election. He was asserting power. And if he could control Toronto, he's controlling the heart of the country. And letting the world know and the Canadians know that basically I have the power, and if I'm going to introduce austerity or anything else, I'm the one who's going to do it. I'm going to be the one who's going to be able to do it. And he was letting the world know that we're open for business and free trade. I'll also gain control over what I need to in order to get the kind of trade agreements I need. Whether or not it was omnipotence, or whether omniscient or omnipresent or whatever he's able, but I certainly think that's probably what he was about. And given the numbers, he seems to have been successful. I mean, inside Toronto, I'm sure they didn't like him before, and probably don't like him anymore now. But he knew that. My speculation.
My name is Trevor Samatov. I guess, well, I fundamentally, philosophically disagree with a couple of panelists on we should have nonviolent sort of over there in the corner legal protest as the police define it that particular day. I think that you both have a very strong argument when it comes to tactics, in that this is in fact a media relations battle, and to look at it as any other thing else is a lost cause from the get-go. And I guess I want to direct my question to the other panelists, in that I have found, as a member of the progressive protesting left, that when it comes to direct action or protest days, while we're quite willing to endlessly debate tactics in basements or university classrooms, there's always this unwillingness to cannibalize the left or have any serious discussions about, you know what, let's not be Big Tent. Let's not have the brick throwers and the flower throwers and the mothers of babies wearing protest signs. Let's include everyone. And frankly, it doesn't work. It never has worked. It dilutes the message, making it meaningless. And so I guess I want to ask some of the other panelists, or all the panelists,
how can the left move in a way that recognizes that this is in fact a media relations war between the Toronto City Police and the protesters, and Big Tent isn't necessarily putting bodies on the streets, isn't going to be the best solution if we're actually wanting to convince Joe Average Canadian that our mission of social justice is something that they should get behind and support. Because that image of the burning car is the lasting one that has left us from G20, no matter how many endless philosophical debates we can have in the side stands.
They're going to have a field day, but I think the fundamental question when you're thinking about what you're trying to convince Joe Average Canadian of, who's clinging to the threatened suburban middle-class lifestyle, which I can characterize a little bit, is are we trying to convince them that if you join the movement for social justice, you'll get that, you'll be more secure in having that, or are we trying to convince them that life is doomed? It's not going to exist in the next generation, except for a much smaller minority, and you should be getting ready for a new way of living. And that's a fundamental question. There's no easy answer, no easy way to reconcile people who fall on different sides of the line with that question.
30 seconds answering the last question again, because I feel like it. Why even have the G20? They could have had a conference call. They could have had dinner at the Socialist Group and had this conversation. They did it as a political act. Exactly. It was done consciously. Wherever it worked, it was no necessity of doing it.
Yeah. Hi, this question is to all panelists. I was actually one of the people that did attend the G20 rally and participate in the protest on Friday and Saturday. And from my experience and from seeing the actions of the protesters, actions of the police, I really felt that mainstream media was blatantly misrepresenting what was going on at the event, the actions of the protesters and the actions of the police. And I was just wondering how the panelists feel the public, as well as the mainstream media outlets themselves, could really be held to more accountable and really better represent the events that are being portrayed in mainstream media.
Amy Goodman was there, and she was part of the Massey Hall, and then she spoke at a church the next night. And her comment was, if the media showed what was happening with Canadian troops and American troops were doing in Afghanistan as many times as they showed the burning car, it would change Canadians' political perspective. But it's not what they do. And so that's why, of course, her perspective is you need the alternative media, because they don't see that as their perspective of their job. And so their job was to do what they did, which was to, people would argue, misdirect the interest, the substantive interest. And her argument was, well, we ought to be showing the real effects of the G20 and the solutions, the policies they're coming to, and not show the burning car sale.
Yeah. I think the key to this is really building large, dynamic, and outward-looking social movements that, because they begin to build momentum, like gathering steam, actually force even the corporate media to actually respond. Not that that's the aim of the movement, but that it happens. I'll give you a couple of examples. In 2001, when the global justice movement was organizing protests against the free trade area of the Americas, the biggest protest there was the one in Quebec City in April of that year. That was a movement that was gathering real steam, and Maclean's magazine, which had not yet become as extremely far right as it's become now. I mean, it's right wing, but it's moving further right every time you seem to look at it. It actually ran a front cover story about Naomi Klein. I think asked the question, is this the face of the new activism? So her book No Logo was out, it was selling lots of copies, and she was seen as an important figure, a spokesperson of that movement. Well, that was done because there was a real movement out there, and the corporate media was responding. They thought they could sell copies of Maclean's by dealing with this person who symbolized a real movement. So some of the movement's analysis and ideas, in a distorted way, got picked up and reflected there because there was something happening on the ground. And the same thing, if you look at the war on Iraq in 2003, the fact that there were huge demonstrations all over the world was very significant in terms of having an impact on the media coverage, even though, of course, the whole points about weapons of mass destruction still got recycled and repeated over and over again without enough critical questioning. So I think the key thing is to change the facts on the ground. And that will have an impact on the media. But let's not focus on the media, let's focus on the grassroots and organizing and reaching out beyond our small circles to other people who aren't yet at the point of agreeing with our analysis and build movements.
You know, I'm going to be the last person to say that for as long as we've had a mass media, the mass media has had a tendency to be distracted by shiny pennies. So it has always been thus. You can look at any political movement or great incident, and you'll see, you know, don't look at the man behind the screen. Just look at the song and dance going on in front. It's one of the great flaws, along with you know, a lot of people try to expound on the principles of journalistic balance and fairness, but the problem is when you're passionate about something, you don't want it to be balanced and fair. And I have this conversation with people all the time. You know, reporting on the articulate, you know, expressions of a legitimate protest movement. I don't like the term legitimate actually, but protest movement will be given equal space at some level in any individual story with people talking about how they don't think what these people are doing is legitimate. And so the people who are passionate about it read the other comments and they don't think that that's fair and balanced. And it's again, it's a fundamental flaw in what we do that, you know, the people out on the street believe there's righteous causes and unrighteous causes. And the media is not always good at paying due respect to some of those nuances. As far as you know, accountability or misrepresentation, you know, when I was in the Toronto Star archives today, digging up all my dusty stuff about the Lytton systems, but you know, I read like the last sort of 2 months of coverage in the Toronto Star on like sort of how the local community is reacting in the aftermath of this thing, and I mentioned briefly the class action suit. $51 million class action suit launched by, well, the person who's the citizen representing the suit is a woman who was trapped in the kettling in the intersection when they blocked everybody in the thunderstorm and then, you know, kind of arrested people one at a time. And so she's suing the federal government for $51 million because she suffers from anxiety attacks now. I mean, the media in Toronto is full of stories of people describing the horrific treatment that they got at the hands of the police. So just for a moment, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the assignment editor at the news desk of the Toronto Star. What criteria, and this is not, I always sound rhetorical when I say this, but tell me what's your criteria for deciding whether these people are legitimately describing what happened or are kind of embellishing what happened because it's their moment of fame. Like if you say to me you were there and you think the brutality and what the police did and what the protesters did was blown out of proportion, you know what, I can get behind that. But tell me how these thousands of people that are deluging the local media there with their stories of barbaric treatment at the hands of the police, should we just stop answering the phone and we shouldn't give them a forum because they disagree with your version of what happened? I'm saying, and I do want to hear your answer, I don't know what to do.
Well, my experience was not so much, I guess, hearing about like the many people bringing up stories about police brutality. Like I think if there's hundreds or thousands of people bringing up stories of police brutality, there's probably police brutality. Like,
you indicated to me though that you thought the media was unaccountable because they had exaggerated the level of police brutality.
No, they actually exaggerated the level of violent protest. Like there was absolutely no coverage, especially on the Saturday, watching it about what police were actually doing. Like I don't feel that there was accountability by representing both sides. Like there was just like the shiny object that just kept on getting looped and looped and looped, and really the important messages that people were actually bringing up were really suppressed in doing that. And I just don't necessarily know how to influence mainstream media to properly represent what actually happened, properly represent the messages that those people are trying to get across, because that is getting lost a little bit.
Yeah, and like I said, I agree that the one burning car became an iconic image because it was easy. It was an easy thing for people to latch onto. I just wonder what the tenor of the coverage would have been if that shiny penny hadn't have been there. Everybody came to Toronto to cover the story. So
if you watch it, if you listen to Amy Goodman, you'll see how she covered the story. And she covered it fundamentally differently than the way the media did in Toronto. And it would be instructive if we could sort of compare the two.
Yeah.
What she did with it versus what they did with it.
Yeah.
And it's clear there's a qualitative difference in how she covered it.
Yes.
With using all the sort of ethics and standards that journalists, would use, the same sort of standards. She has a different set of values, a different perspective, and she covered it fundamentally different.
Amy.
But I suppose the question is, what can you do to change mainstream media? As you do what David suggested. You engage in social movement activism, but you do that not necessarily at the G20. I'm not saying don't go to the G20. Again, I want to be clear here. But it's probably not going to be your best forum. But you continue being the activist you are, and getting your word out, and educating people, educating the public, so that you begin to engender within the public, and therefore the media, a different way of thinking and discourse. But it's not going to come from the G20, because I think those protest moments are going to be framed by bigger things, and things are going to detract from your message ultimately. I mean, I'm talking just for the G20. Right?
Hi, my name is Nick, and I have a question about diversity of tactics. Mr. Powell, you characterize diversity of tactics as an opt-out card from having to have that large debate about larger strategy and what the goal of the movement is. And Mr. Camfield, you were talking about how the left need to recognize that there's the real other, the real enemy, and we need to have debate and also have go towards a common strategy. Coming from Vancouver and being part of the activist community there, having seen the Olympics where, the resistance against the Olympics, more importantly, and the use of diversity of tactics there, I really thought diversity of tactics in that regard was not an opt-out card from having an actual debate on what the strategy is. I mean, there is still conflict about what the real strategy is behind just a single goal of getting rid of the Olympics, but using diversity of tactics is, in case of Vancouver, to me, was to not eat itself and bicker, as Mr. Camfield was saying, and actually to have space to debate that. So I guess my question would be more towards Mr. Powell and Mr. Camfield and Mr. Chernomas. Do you find that the use of the term diversity of tactics in general is an opt-out card from having the larger debate? Or if it's not, then maybe there's some case of the use of diversity tactics that are different from others, in terms of its actual substance as just opposed to the term.
I'm just getting signals from the back that this will be the last question.
Well, my answer to that would be that the second, that like anything, diversity of tactics, direct action, physical confrontation, I think it's pretty hard to generalize and to lay down some kind of across-the-board rule that says this is good, this is bad. I think in some contexts, the diversity of tactics has been something people say because we haven't yet figured out what we're going to do. But I don't mean that it's necessarily always a bad thing at all. It can be a really positive and productive thing. Forceful tactics and conciliatory tactics, to use this language rather than violent and nonviolent, But force and conciliation can complement each other, as the example of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X showed. One of the really interesting questions, this goes back to the question about organization. How is this discussion going to take place? How is it already taking place? How is it going to take place? The traditional political model we have in Western liberal democracies is a model of representation. A bunch of people get together and a few people end up becoming the representatives and spokespeople of all the rest. And if it's done properly and legitimately, then people feel that they're being spoken for. If it's done improperly, they don't feel that they're being spoken for. And that does achieve certain effects, but also it's undeniably a hierarchical structure. And one of the disagreements in the movements is precisely over this question of how hierarchical and how representative the movement should be. Should it be a representative, or should it be something more decentralized and non-hierarchical? And so there's not just a discussion about what to do, there's a discussion about how to discuss what to do, and that puts an added spin on things.
I struggle to try to get a grasp on, try to understand the world, what's making it work. I am absolutely stunned at the, for want of a better term, the cliche false consciousness. I mean, you look at the United States and the Tea Party movement, people voting against health and education for their children, voting for capital gains tax cuts for the rich, which they'll never see in their lives. 39% of the Americans believe they're either in the top 1% or will be soon of the income distribution. We voted for Harper. It's true, a minority voted for Harper. And to tell you the truth, I do not understand why this happens, and I look for you for tactics to fix things.
Okay, so the signals are getting more emphatic now, so I guess we'll have to cut it short. I just want to thank sort of the sponsors, people who hopped on board and set up tables, Copwatch, Council of Canadians, Femrev, and there's one more I forget. So anyways, before we adjourn, I'd just like to give a quick plug. Femrev have asked me to do this. Femrev is hosting a dance party tonight at Geo's, which is just 5 minutes walk south from the library on the corner of Smith and York. I encourage everyone to head there if you'd like to dance or listen to people speaking to an open mic, which will also be happening. The open mic starts at 8:30, and Mama Cutsworth will be DJing starting at 10:30. And the money raised during the party will go to support the Rebels Gathering, which is a feminist conference happening in Winnipeg during the May of next year. And so I'd like to thank you all for attending, thank you all for the excellent questions, and especially I'd like to thank the panelists for providing excellent